Greetings, Kerbonauts! This is Kerbal Space Program. I'm Bob Fitch, and look at this. We're up to episode number 18 of Project Ares. We're still looking at the Galileo planet pack. Now, you remember that space station you saw a moment ago? It's the one we began last episode. We're calling it the Mars Station, and it's here orbiting around Gale. But we need to send up some extra habitation space because we're using USI's life support, and that requires habitation space for the Kerbals. They need enough leg room to move around there. We're going to send up some living modules with cupolas on them so that they can look out at the stars and feel happy about where they are and not really so worried about needing to be back down on the ground. This is not a test launch of the modules. I just went straight for the real thing without any testing because I'm using the same lower stage as the launcher that I used for the station core. The only new thing is the payload, and those are fairly simple. It's just a living space, a cupola, and a decoupler. Now, it is the new types of decouplers, though, the ones that can weld two pieces together, and we'll be doing that 3 times to put these new 3 modules on today. We're watching the launch mostly from orbit today because sometimes I like to do that. I like to see the lines that show where we're flying right now and show how we're approaching and whether we're getting close with our close approach indicators, seeing the cool planet surface with all the clouds and the blue water and the green earth down there underneath us. It looks like the liftoff was right on time because our intercept is practically right on the money there. I have done better in the past, but not in this install yet. This is about as close as I've gotten so far with my launches. But we can easily set up a couple maneuvers here or there in order to rendezvous before we go past our apoapsis and end up suborbital, going back into the atmosphere, burning up and losing our modules. The main thing I'm trying to do right there is just line up my ascending node and my apoapsis together so that this next maneuver will be nice and easy. And here we go, dropping that first stage, dropping that fairing, powering up just a tiny bit so that my maneuver node can understand how long it's going to be, because you know how whenever you switch to a new stage, the maneuvers don't know what the new engine is going to be capable of, so you have to power it for just a couple seconds, and then it starts to understand how fast it can go. And that in turn tells you how long your maneuvers are going to be, and I need that because we're about to intercept our station. Notice right here how we're still super suborbital, but it's a pretty powerful second stage engine, and we should be able to catch up real quick. Now, as a reminder, I said previously there are 3 teams. We have Team Wonder working on discovery and research, Team Liberty trying to find a way home. So this launch is part of Team Pilgrim, the group that is looking at what happens if we need to stay here. So they're responsible for things like life support and habitation modules. The Team Wonder project was our Talumo satellite that's on its way to investigate the strange signal. Do you remember we got a signal? Possibly man-made or Kerbal-made. We want to go and find out what that is. So I'm going to warp ahead an extra week. In fact, just in general, I'm going to try to put some time in between different missions, like maybe a week or 2 weeks, depending upon how complicated I think the mission is. Now that said, we have 3 different science teams all working in parallel, so maybe some of them, like maybe each individual team has to put a week or 2 weeks at least in between each of their missions, but if I happen to have all 3 of them ready to go at the same time, well then we could have back-to-back launches. And we're almost there now. We're just fine-tuning our approach with the RCS. You can see the close approach distance marker here is going down. I'm going to try to get that as close as possible, then I'll get rid of that lower stage. This time I have remembered to put a probe core on it, so we can deorbit that stage now. There's a little monopropellant-filled space tug up on the top of the 3 modules, and that'll be able to deorbit itself as well. In the VAB, I used the RCS balancer to make sure that each individual section was balanced with the others, because we're going to start out with 3 modules, then we'll dock 1, decouple 2 of those, dock another, decouple the last one, dock that, and then get rid of the RCS little space tug. But each step along the way, we need to make sure that the RCS is balanced so that docking will be easy. And there we go, the final stage has decoupled. You can see it in the bottom right as it flips over and gets ready for a retro burn to deorbit itself. Meanwhile, in the upper left, the 3 modules are getting ready to dock. The 3 docking nodes they are targeting are on the module that is on the very bottom of the screen right here. All around the middle, there are 4 spots. 1 spot is already occupied by a cupola, and the other 3 are the weldable docking ports. Now about those weldable docking ports, I need to tell you something I have learned about them. Remember, each side is capable of being extended or retracted. And at first I thought that you needed to retract both sides and then weld them together. But what I have found is that you can actually screw it up. There's two different ways to mess it up. One is that you don't actually have to retract both sides. Before welding, you only have to retract one side, and once you do that, it'll give you the weld button, and then when it welds, it might leave a gap in between the modules. The second way you can mess up is that they don't necessarily have to be completely lined up. The things don't dock before they weld. Well, they can, but they don't always. As soon as it's retracted, the weld button appears, and if it's not exactly lined up the way you want it to be, you can still hit weld, and it will weld. The docking ports will disappear, the two parts will be connected together, so to speak, but there can be a little bit of a gap. I had that happen to one of my dockings, and so now I've learned the lesson. In the future, I'm going to make sure that everything is lined up. I also think if you turn off the SAS, then the electromagnets that are trying to pull the two ends together may be able to hold it lined up better. Whereas with the SAS still on, it might be trying to hold a previous orientation, and that can cause you to be not completely lined up. It's possible that that's what happened to me in this case, although generally I do, when I'm docking, turn off my SAS right at the very end, because I know that once the ships dock together, if the SAS was still on, then sometimes things will freak out, and that can include spontaneous destruction of your ship, but at the very least can mean that it starts wiggling and using up SAS when you don't want it to. Or I mean RCS, using up your monopropellant. Now you can see there that they explode when the parts disappear. Don't be freaked out, nothing is actually being destroyed, it's just the parts disappearing. Apparently the mod creator decided that it would be cool to explode them, and so that's what happens. But everything is docked well, and now we're ready to release that third module, bring that one up to the last docking port there, and then we will have loads of habitation space. And with the cupolas, we have, what, 4 cupolas now? Nope, make that 5. There's one on each module, and then one on the core living space where they have the disco ball. Each of those has a nice Hab multiplier. And that means it'll result in whatever value we come up with being multiplied by more than 1. I think it might be 0.5 per cupola. And with 5 cupolas, that's an extra 2.5. So 1 plus 2.5 is 3.5 times the overall habitation space will give us a nice long living time. All right, we're done. We're undocking the little space tug, spinning it around to take it slightly away from the station before we begin our retro burn. It has a small engine on there. It's powered by monopropellant, and we can use that for however long it takes to deorbit, which as it turned out was quite a while. The deorbit burn was several minutes, the engine was just too weak. But whatever, it gets the job done. And so while that heads back down into the atmosphere, let's go back and look at the space station, because it was around this point that I realized the 150 kilometer orbit that I had been targeting so that I can go into warp speed is only what I have on one side of my orbit. Apparently I had forgotten to boost it, and so it's going from about 100 kilometers to 150, and I'd like it to be at least 150, and in retrospect, it probably should be more like a 200 by 200. That way I have some maneuvering room both above and below while still being able to go into the higher warp that 150 kilometers allows. Fortunately, the station is very light and welded together, it doesn't wiggle too much. And with the RCS ports still all over the outside of it, which I will take off later using Kerbal Attachment System, and I'll just extract those to reduce my part count. I won't need them anymore, but right now it was convenient to have them to rotate the ship into, at the time, what I thought was the correct direction. It turns out I was making a mistake here. But that's the second problem. The first problem we need to solve is that somehow my action groups have lost access to the 4 engines on the bottom, and they were turned off, and I'd like an action group that can turn them on and off. So I use action groups extended to fix that first. Then I can toggle those off, figure out whether or not I have the bottom engine on or not. It turns out that I didn't. I had to turn that on. I had to turn off the core engine that was on the station. But once that's all squared away, then we plan on using the engine on our crew vehicle there to boost the station's orbit up into a 200 kilometer circular orbit. Now I'm assuming I'll have to keep my thrust really, really low, because look how lopsided the station is. The engine is way off the center of mass right now. But if I keep it low, the thrust low, and I gimbal it a little bit, and I use the RCS, I might be able to get us boost it into that 200 kilometer orbit without going off and flying all crazy with the off-center thrust. It'll be a little bit of a testing game where I try to throttle it up and see if I'm losing control, throttle back down if I am, maybe turn it off, turn it back on again, find just the right spot. And I do all of that, but then I find out that I have totally messed up something. I don't know how I didn't pay attention to the fact that I was very obviously thrusting up rather than forward along the prograde, but once I finally realized it, even though I had used up a bunch of fuel and more importantly monopropellant, I clicked on the capsule because I know that that is pointing in the direction I want to go, and I said control from here, and that reoriented my nav ball, which of course reoriented all of my vectors, and so now I know which direction is the correct prograde, and so we resume the burn, this time boosting us up to our proper 200 kilometers. But by the time I get done doing all of that, I feel like I've run out of too much monopropellant, so I'm going to have to bring up extra supplies, include some monopropellant when I do that, and then try again. But this time, since we're already going from whatever 100 something up to 200, we'll just boost to the lower side, bring that up to 200, and then we'll be in the orbit that we're targeting. Now, due to the low thrust we were using, that took a really, really long time, but it's good enough for now. Then at this point, I go to the tracking station so I can skip us ahead by at least 7 days, since as I told you, I want to put some time in between all of my missions. Team Wonder satellite heading to Tulumo needs to go a little bit further ahead than it already was. The next Team Wonder project is we need to go back to Iota. Somehow we have lost contact with the satellite that we had sent there earlier. But that's okay, we need to do a scan looking for a good place to land because we're going to go and investigate the surface. It is our new closest moon after all. Speaking of moon, every now and then I get a little comment about how the moon that is in regular Kerbin system is Mun. If you were to spell that like this, you would actually call that Mune. But since it isn't spelled like that, we can call it Mun. Hope that clears it up for everybody. Now let's get back to our regularly scheduled program. Greetings, Kerbinauts. This is Kerbal Exploding Space Program. Nah, we're fine. The launcher we're using for the new Iota scanner is actually a reuse of the single-manned capsule launcher that we had earlier. You remember this one? I had originally tried sending it up on the old scanner launcher, but I guess I wasn't paying attention, and the payload must be heavier than the previous scanner was. That resulted in me not having enough delta V once I got to low orbit, and I didn't think that I was going to be able to reach the moon Iota and capture an orbit there. So I switched the payload away from having a capsule to having a fairing so that we could put our satellite up in there. It still has the same launch problems that the old one did, even with the little fins on the bottom, and maybe actually because of the fins on the bottom. It really wants to fly straight, just go prograde, and anytime you try to push it off of prograde, it pushes itself back again. So it's hard to do gravity turns, but I guess the silver lining is you're very, very, very unlikely, to the point of it being impossible, to flip over and go the wrong direction. This thing basically flies itself. Alrighty, we've made it up to orbit. You can see that I had targeted that pseudo-satellite marker that I keep in orbit. It's marked as an airplane so that I can toggle them on and off when I want to see my markers. And I aimed myself down toward that orbit. When I got there, that's when I did my inclination change to try to line me up with Iota, because that particular airplane pseudo-satellite marker is lined up with the inclination of Iota, which happens to be equatorial to this world, but we don't launch from the equator, we launch from 9 degrees. That slight inclination change was absorbed into my cost of getting the circular orbit. And I did all of that because I didn't really want to wait until I was lined up just perfectly with where I'm going and go over the pole. This launcher has a lot more delta V, like I just said a moment ago, and so we should be okay doing it like this. As a scanning satellite, I want to test it first here before we leave and make sure that it's working before we get over to Iota. Our maneuver is bringing it over Iota's north pole, where we'll do our burn to circularize, let's say about 400 to 500 kilometer orbit, because that's what the scanner says it wants, its ideal range. Well, at least one of the scanners is around 500. maybe 400. The other one wants to be higher, so we might do some scanning from low, and then later, after that scan is done, we'll boost our orbit up higher and do the second scan from its ideal orbit. Meanwhile, here we have been deorbiting the lower stage. It was really easy. We just do a radial out maneuver, and that brings our periapsis down so low that it goes back into the atmosphere. Now, it'll be a long time before it gets all the way up into the apoapsis and back down again before it's destroyed, but we don't have any other missions around. It's very unlikely it's going to collide with anything. Space is big out there. In the space above Iota, we have arrived. We've captured our orbit, and now we're waiting until we drop it down to the periapsis. It's going to take hours to get down there. But once there, we can do the circular orbit at the 400 kilometers and begin our scanning. This moon goes a lot faster. It rotates a lot faster than SETI does. Remember how when we saw it SETI, it wasn't rotating very fast, so it was going to take days to get a complete scan, but here, this one rotates much quicker, and we should be able to get a complete scan far sooner than we could over there. Now our next project is Team Pilgrim, looking to add some supplies to our Mars station above Gale, but it looks like they have misjudged their thrust-to-weight ratio at sea level. It could be just me, but I think generally once you launch, you're supposed to leave the launch pad. Yeah, I think that's true. Well, it hasn't toppled over yet, and this is a test, so I'm going to keep on going with it, see if we can get rid of some of that fuel, and once the thrust to weight goes up, maybe we can do some of the actual testing that we want to do, find out what the problems are. It is a new launcher after all, and so therefore this is just a simulation. We're writing down all of the things that are wrong with it. I got my pad of paper beside me, I've got my pencil, well, black pen really, but whatever, pencil. And so the first thing we're going to write down is what? Indeed, yes, we're going to write down that there is not enough thrust at sea level. I must have looked at the vacuum thrust value and said, oh, that looks plenty. And of course, as a new launcher, it hasn't been completely set up with things like RCS, toggles, and disabling. We don't have all the lights on the outside of it that we need. I considered putting some roll engines on it, but then I thought, nah, we don't really need to worry about roll like they do in real life. So I jot those few down on the paper as we get started here and finally have some thrust and are finally going in the right direction, although it took a while. We're not going to get as high as we would like to, of course, but as long as we get to space, we don't need to orbit to do all of the testing. Other things we're putting down, let's see. So it looked like it was wiggling a lot, and I don't know if that was because of our low thrust, or if it really is wiggling. So we might need to look into doing some strutting on there, not sure. The interstage apparently needs a thrust change. The fairing is out of order in the staging. Stage 2 needs some retro rockets to fire and pull that away. The fairing needs a little bit more power so that when it separates, it'll pop away from the body faster. The payload's decoupler seemed to be a little bit too strong. And after that, we didn't really find anything, so I went down to the VAB and I did another test. I added some SRBs on there, although those had a problem where they seemed to be heating up a bit. And when it went to decoupling, they didn't actually leave, so they must have been attached not to the decoupler but to the body, the fuel tank. And as new SRBs, they don't have thrust curves on them yet, so I'll have to go down and make a config file that puts a thrust curve on those. And finally, for stage 2, I decided that I wanted to slow it down a little bit when it decoupled, and so I was going to take half of the solid fuel out of that retro firing. But finally, after all of that, we're about as good as we're going to get for a real launch, and so here we go. And we have liftoff of the ship that's going to Iota. Actually, come to think of it, I don't really have very good names for these things. I should ask you guys and gals, what should the names of all of my things be? We have the one, Mars Station is in orbit, but we need some really cool special names for all the little things, like a satellite going and scanning Iota or SETI or things like that. Yes, I decoupled a couple seconds too early there. Anyway, so do this, put in the comments a bunch of satellite or mission names that you'd like to see, and I'll pick some of the ones that I like, and I'll rename the ones that I've already sent, and anything in the future I'll pick from the list of names you've put, and I'll name the future stuff from that list too. Alright, so the rest of this launch goes relatively well. You saw a lot of what it looked like when we were doing the test flight, so we're just gonna skip ahead here to the orbital insertion part. You can see that just ahead we've managed to get ourselves a close approach. So it should be relatively easy going from here. Our Kerbals on the station are looking forward to all the snacks that are coming up in this module. Now, normally right around here, I'd give you a little bit of the story of what's going on with the Kerbals, but instead, I'm going to go back and take a look at my real solar system install that we had been using at the beginning of the series. I couldn't remember exactly what was going on, it's been so long since we've seen it, and when I loaded it up, I remembered we had this spaceship on its way to the moon, the real Earth moon. 3 Kerbals on board are on their way over there to do a little bit of exploration and science. So instead of some story, we'll check in with them, we'll see what was going on, and carry out a little bit of that mission. Well, obviously we can see here that they had been almost there halfway to the moon, and once I reached the sphere of influence, I just needed to make a little radial in maneuver to bring our periapsis in nice and close. One problem though, I couldn't control the craft. I was clicking on various things trying to figure out what's going on with this. Why can't I control it? Is it communications problem? No, there's Kerbals inside. That can't be it. What's the problem? And then a good old forehead slapping, "Oh, look, I have no electrical power." But I know that can't be because this is supposed to have a fuel cell on board. And if it does have a fuel cell, it should have a button to turn that on, but I couldn't find the button for it. In fact, I couldn't find any module that had anything like that. So I double-checked my configuration files, and it's that big core module with the windows in the front where everybody's supposed to be sitting that has the fuel cell installed. Now, why I couldn't find the button and why it wasn't on, I'm not sure. But I can just imagine what was going on inside the capsule.
Mission Control, this is Moon 1. Go ahead, Moon 1. We have lost all electrical power. Stand by. We're reading down here that your primary circuits are offline. Switch to auxiliary. Okay, switching to auxiliary now. Yep, that did it. Power's back on. Alright, Moon 1, good luck.
Now in reality, what really happened was I saved the game, closed it, edited the config file to set the fuel cell to always be on so it didn't need to be toggled, and then reloaded the game. The fuel cell had been there all along, it just wasn't turning on correctly, but setting it to always on made it come on, and so then we started slowly getting back power. Most of the time I have to keep the SAS off though, because it's draining a lot of power when it's on. Anyway, with that problem fixed, we can now get back to the issue of the delta V. I couldn't remember exactly how much delta V I was going to need, but I figure the closer you are to the planet, the less it's going to take in order to circularize. So I just figured, oh, well, let's get it really close. The maneuver node isn't really what my maneuver is going to be. I'm just going to burn radially until I like what my periapsis looks like. I was figuring maybe about 100,000 or so. Although in the end, I think it ended up being around 40 to 50,000. And that's meters, so of course 40 to 50 kilometers off the surface. Now here we are doing our retro burn very low to the surface, and as you can see, we have flipped upside down, indicating that we have captured our orbit. Turns out I have a lot of delta V remaining, so we should be okay. Also, all 6 of those tanks around the outside edge there in that ring, those are disposable. We can drop those. So if we want to do any maneuvers and go and look at things or whatever we want, we can do all of that while here, flying around the moon, and then drop a lot of dead mass once all that fuel's gone, and it should be very easy to get home again. The objective there will be to rendezvous with the space station. This is a craft that does not go back home again, as in down to the surface. It stays in orbit and goes back and forth between the moon as needed. One last look at us floating along over the moon's surface here, slowly tumbling due to both persistent rotation functioning in my RSS install, and the fact that our SAS is turned off to conserve power. But we will get back to them next week. We will also be getting back to this mission that is bringing up the new module to Mars Station next week, because that is going to do it for this one. Until next time, I will see you later, Kerbonauts.